My name is Jeff Hoyt. I'm going to be talking about heavy metal testing here. Testing for heavy metals can be challenging just because there's so many tests and all of the tests are going to be limited because the only way to get a true analysis of the toxic metals that are hiding in your organs is through a biopsy, which is not conducted on people that are alive. So it's really not an option. So you have urine tests, you have blood tests, you've got fecal tests, you've got the hair HTMA test, you've got ELISA, which is a lymphocyte reaction test, so testing your sensitivity to the metals. Then there's bioenergetic testing, like electrodermal screening or muscle testing. And then there's the Oligoscan, which I'm going to get into, which is kind of the newest heavy metal test available, and my personal favorite, which is a tissue analysis. So the kind of the closest thing to a biopsy that's available. So the thing to understand with heavy metal testing is you have to understand what you're looking at. What are you testing? So the testing, most of the methods are valid. They're good methods. It's just you have to understand what you're looking at. So, for example, with a blood test, you're looking at what is currently being transported, what is circulating in the body. And that can be helpful if you were just exposed to a toxic element and you want to get your levels tested to see how much is in there. But it's not telling you what the body is excreting, and it's not telling you what is stored in organs. All right, so it's limited there. You have the urine testing, which is just testing what is being excreted. So that can be helpful, but also it's not telling you what's stored. And then you have the hair testing, which is generally recognized as kind of a 3-month average of what is being excreted from the body. And there's a few respectable labs that are doing that. And the hair testing is generally, the practitioners utilizing that are usually looking more at the mineral ratios and to determine oxidation rates and things. So it's a little bit different there. Then you've got some of the bioenergetic testing where you're testing kind of the body's reaction to specific metals, seeing if there's a response through muscle testing or electrodermal screening or something like that. Then you have the Oligoscan, which is going to be actually using spectrophotometry, so light, to measure, to detect the level of heavy metals in the palm of your hand. So that's really it's an intracellular marker. So it's looking at the palm of your hand, measuring tissue levels. So in terms of, it's basically equivalent to a biopsy, but only of your hand. So none of the tests are going to be able to detect levels in organs. So that has to be understood. And you have to understand that in all these tests, you're going to get false negatives, especially if you're not naturally detoxing properly. So the sicker one is, generally they're worse off their detox pathways are. So they're actually going to have more false negatives than a healthier person, because their body is keeping these metals in storage. So you have to understand that there's kind of different levels of toxicity and toxin storage. You've got, when you're just exposed to the toxic elements, let's just say heavy metals, they're going to be kind of circulating. So that's where they would show up in a blood test. But your body's going to try to process those and remove as many as possible from the body. And as it removes them, that would then show up in a urine test or some other excretion test. Whatever the body cannot naturally remove, if it can't remove it all, it has to do something with, because it wants to remain homeostasis in the blood, right? So that's what the body's priority is short-term survival. So what the body does is it takes those metals and it puts them into fat somewhere. So general tissue or organs. And at that point, the body just keeps them there in storage. They're not going to be showing up on a blood test because they're no longer circulating, because the body wanted to kick them out of the blood. And they're not going to be showing up on a urine test or hair test, fecal test, and probably not going to be showing up in the bioenergetic testing either, because the body's not currently processing them. It's just keeping them in fat and storage. And that could either just be the general tissue, which we are measuring with the Oligoscan, so it's the only test that's actually going to be able to detect those metals. But if those metals have moved on to what I consider level 3, the deep storage, which is more organs, those are not going to be detectable on any test, at least with one test. So, and I've kind of developed a system to determine if you do have metals in the organs, which we're going to get to in a bit here. But kind of my 3 levels of detox: you have level 1, which is circulatory, kind of what your body is currently processing. Level 2 metals, that's what's in kind of short-term storage, right? General fat tissue somewhere. And then deep storage is level 3. That's going to be most of the organs and deeply stored areas. So the excretionary tests are measuring level 1 metals. The Oligoscan is measuring level 2 metals. And the only way to measure level 3 metals is with the biopsy, which is not really an option. So just to look, here's an example of a urine test. And you can see with this individual, it wasn't a challenge test. So that is one thing that is done a lot with the urine test is a urine challenge test. So a chelator will be generally given, and they'll usually do a baseline, so like this, and it shows what the body's naturally excreting. So in this individual, it looks like, oh, there's no metals. Now, what we have to understand, what is it telling us? It's telling us that no metals are coming out of the urine. So that could mean one of two things. It could mean this person doesn't have any heavy metals, or it could mean that the body is not actively releasing them, and it's just keeping these metals stored in tissue or an organ somewhere. And the fact that you have the high urinary creatinine, and so there's some kidney stress or something going on, is probably a sign that the body's just not actively detoxing, because potentially it's too stressful on the kidneys, and the body would just prefer keep the metals in organs. Because back to the body's priority, which is short-term survival, it focuses on that short-term survival over the long-term thrival, long-term function of the body. So the body would prefer to keep toxic metals in organs, even if it is deteriorating the organ, opposed to having the stress of the removal process. So that's always something to consider. So the sicker someone is, the more complex the health challenge, the less metals they're going to have being excreted, because the body can't handle that stress. So that's the first thing to understand. If you get a test done, any sort of excretion test, whether it's hair, urine, or even blood or fecal or whatever it is, and it shows no metals, it doesn't mean you have no metals. It just means they're not coming out. So then a challenge test is sometimes done where they'll do a baseline and it says, okay, no metals. Then they'll give this individual a chelator, DMPA, DMPS, DMPA, EDTA, something that goes in and rips out some metals. Then they'll retest and they'll see if the levels rise, because that would indicate now there are metals present, but they just weren't excreting on their own. So that is good information. It still doesn't tell you really where the metals came from, and it's going to be limited because the chelators are specific to certain metals. So if lead rises, if you're using EDTA, you assume, oh, lead's my main problem, but really mercury might be your biggest problem. It's just not going to be, most chelators are not going to be able to effectively address it. So very limited, but can be helpful. It's just you have to understand what you're looking at here. So just as a comparison to the Oligoscan, this test actually was from an individual who also did the Oligoscan. And you see that here it looks like she has no metals. But when we look at her Oligoscan, which is the tissue test using spectrophotometry, you see that, bam, tons of heavy metals showing up. So it's just showing that her body was not, and she did have some health issues, so her body was not actively removing. It wasn't excreting. That's why there was nothing showing up in the urine. But when you look at the tissue, more of an intracellular marker in the palm of the hand, you've got all these metals. And that could explain why the urinary creatinine was high. There was some stress occurring. But yeah, high mercury, high aluminum, all these metals are high. And you could tell she had the amalgam fillings in her mouth because mercury and silver were high, which is usually the case if you have the fillings. And the nice thing about the Oligoscan is you also are able to look at vitamin and mineral status. So you can see her mineral, and these are intracellular tissue levels of minerals. So it's a really cool test. And it's an instant result because it's spectrophotometry. So you can check out theoligoscan.com for more information. And there's a find a provider tab if you want to find someone locally to get tested. So you can see here, and the minerals usually correspond to the metals. So you have low silicone, and that's a lot of times because you have high aluminum because they fight for space in the cell. And then you have low iodine, and the selenium's low as well, and high mercury. So those correspond as well. So very interesting stuff. But the point is, she definitely has an issue, a toxic burden of heavy metals, but the urine test wasn't able to show it. But it's clearly seen here. So then with the same individual, we put her on a detox protocol. And then 3 weeks later, so it was a very effective detox protocol for her. She had to stay on it for much longer, but just after 3 weeks, here's her results. And you can see the initial test in gray. And this is what you can do with the Oligoscan as well, as compare two tests side by side. So initial test and then retest 3 weeks later was in the color below. And you have an incredible reduction in a lot of these metals, right? So if she would have, and she didn't, but if she would have gotten another urine test at this point, this is when all of these metals likely would have been showing up in the urine as high levels, because now they're leaving the body. They're coming from the tissue in the hand and they're lowering, meaning they're going into the bloodstream and then they're leaving the body through the urine. And that's when they would show up in the test. But on the initial test with the urine, nothing was showing up because the body was just keeping these metals in storage, which is very common because a lot of times the body just resists detox. Here's a sample report of an HTMA, hair tissue mineral analysis from trace elements. And you can see you're getting some mineral levels, which is nice. You're getting some of the heavy metals. And then you also get the ratios. So the thing with these tests is, once again, their excretion, it's just what is coming out of the hair, right? And it's the hair grows fairly slowly, so it's going to be more of an average over time. So it can be an effective test, but once again, you can get a lot of false negatives because if the body's not excreting mercury and it's just keeping it in the tissue, it's not really going to show up. So this individual was detoxing some things, but a lot of times mercury is the most problematic metal for people, but it's the least likely to show up on the tests because the body holds on to it the tightest, because it's the most toxic to remove and the body's more resistant to it. So it's always something to consider with these tests. The HTMA does have some additional benefits because a lot of people use it to determine oxidation rates based on specific ratios, and there's some interesting things there as well. The ELISA test is a test that looks at the lymphocyte reaction. So basically, it's not determining a specific level of heavy metals in the body, but it's determining if you're hypersensitive to that metal, which can be helpful as well, because basically when it comes to toxicity, I like to look at three things. I like to look at the level present. Are there elevated markers? I like to look at the immune reactivity to the metal, and then also the synergy between metals. Those are three things kind of to consider. So two people might have the same amount of mercury, but if one person is hypersensitive to the mercury, then it's going to be more of a problem for them. And then another thing to consider is the synergy between metals. So when you combine specific metals, they can become synergistically more toxic than the individual metals as well. So a few things to consider there. So here we're going to look at an example of, this is using the Oligoscan. So once again, we're looking at the tissue levels in the hand, and we're going to kind of look at what I'm calling detox cycling. And it's very interesting. So that's why I prefer the Oligoscan. It's really the only heavy metal test I'm using at this point, because I can get really good data from it, right? Because while there's no way to determine what, the specific levels of the metals in organs without a biopsy, with the Oligoscan, I can basically determine, are there metals in organs and how fast are they coming out? Because when the level rises, as in this case, you have the initial in gray, and then the colored was the retest, you can see the metals are higher. That means they're coming out of the level 3. They're coming out of the deeply stored areas, organs, and they're coming in to the hand. And then they'll be, once the levels go down, which we're going to see, that's when they're being excreted from the body. So the body's kind of cycling in these phases of detox, dumping the metals from level 3 to level 2, and then clearing them out into level 1 as they excrete from the body, and then the process repeats. So it's very interesting stuff. With all the other metal tests, if the levels rise, which generally you want, that's another thing. A lot of people get a metals test and then they retest in a month or 6 months or whenever they retest, and sometimes the metals are higher, and then they assume the detox protocol was contaminated or they were exposed to a lot of metals. But you actually generally want to see higher metals on the retest, regardless of the test, because that means the metals are now being excreted. They're now on the move, and that's what you want, because the baseline tests, except for the Oligoscan, are not measuring the tissue levels. Now, what you don't know with all those other tests is where the metals are coming from, because most of the time they're just coming from general tissue and they're leaving the body. And that's where they're going to show up in the urine and the hair, etc. But those are easier to remove from the body than the deeply stored metals in organs generally. So on the Oligoscan, what's really nice is when the levels rise like this, you know they're coming from organs because the baseline was already general tissue. So it's really the only test that's actually determining, do you have metals in organs and are you detoxing them effectively? So it's pretty nifty. So for example, with the urine test, on the initial test, it could show no metals. And then the retest could show high metals because now they're being excreted from the body. And then, but maybe they're only coming from level 2, general tissue, but none from organs. And then it goes back to 0 because the body stopped excreting or it got them out of general tissue. And then you think you got all the metals out of your body. It's possible that you never even got to that deep level detox of the organs, but you just can't tell with those tests. So with the Oligoscan, here we go. We see the levels are higher, indicating the body is pushing out these metals from organs. They're coming into the hand. And then this is the same individual over the next 5 tests here. The next test, the levels came back down. So really interesting. So they came up. So that means they're coming out of organs into general tissue. Then they come down, meaning they're going from the general tissue into level 1 where it's going to be excreted from the body. And then testing and the levels are up again. So aluminum is skyrocketing, mercury's high. Next test, down, back down. Next test, up again. So you see the body kind of cycles in and out. It's never going to continuously just dump the metals from the organs into general tissue because it would kind of fill up that general tissue area. There's a threshold, it appears, that the body's comfortable with. And then once it fills up, the body releases and it just goes in phases. And this individual, it's on the same exact protocol. So she's not pulsing on and off. She's not doing anything differently. And all she was doing was taking ZeoCharge, Zeolite. So it was very effective, but her body was in control of detox. That's another key. The best way to detox is for your body to naturally release these metals. And then the body naturally goes through these cycles and it processes the metals. Interesting. So that's what the Oligoscan is really good at. It shows how the body is processing metals and if you are in fact detoxing, because a lot of people, unfortunately, are taking some products that they think are working and they're just not. And sometimes they're good products. It's just because the body's hesitant to detox, sometimes your body just won't let you detox. So anyway, we have up, down, up, down, up, down, up. And then this is a comparison between her first test and her last test. So super interesting. This is over 9 months. So it looks like absolutely nothing moved. But in reality, levels went up, down, up, and they're back to baseline. Oh, wait, here we go. Back to baseline. So it appears that there's a very specific, the body is incredibly intelligent, and this can be seen here. There appears to be a very specific level that the body is comfortable with to maintain in general tissue of these toxic metals. And when the level rises, and then it just goes back. And it's not that you're accumulating more, it's that the metals are coming out of the organs, and then the body pushes them out of the body, and then it completes the cycle, but it goes back to kind of a resting phase, and it just cycles. And this is on the same protocol. So the body, even without pulsing off the detox products, the body is resting on its own, at least with the ZeoCharge Zeolite, which is a gentle detox. And in other products, might not be the case. But one, you can see the reproducibility and sensitivity of this test, the Oligoscan. After 9 months, we're looking at identical levels here. Absolutely incredible. And after all that movement, so the body is very specific in what it wants and what it does. Absolutely incredible. But that shows the importance of retesting as well. A lot of people they want to get a test, whatever method they're using. Then they want to retest after 6 months or 9 months or a year and see if the metals are gone or if the metals are lower. And each test is a snapshot, and you just don't have you want a larger storybook. You want the more snapshots, the more complete your story. So if you just had these 2 tests, it looks like nothing happened, and she would probably be upset. But when you looked at them, okay, she's detoxing. Everything is going really well, but you have to see the process occurring through multi-tests. So that's why, in general, with most tests, it's like, especially with the urine or the blood, you just randomly get tested. You're really not getting very good information. The only helpful information is if something shows up really high, you have it. But it's just hit or miss because, for example, in this scenario, when the level rises here, if she got a urine test, those metals are not going to be excreting from the body because they're going from organs to general tissue, but they're not yet leaving the body. But if she would have tested here, as the metals are leaving the body, they're going to show up on the urine test. And then she tests here, not going to show up. Here, they're going to show up again. Here, not going to show up, right? So it's just hit or miss. That's why it can be very complicated and confusing when you're looking at various heavy metal analysis, because various tests, because it's just what cycle of detox is the body in and when did you hit it. So that's why with whatever method you're using, I'm an advocate for regular testing. Every month is, I think every 3 weeks could be really helpful, but cost is an issue. But it's just the regular testing to identify how the body is processing the metals is what I think. I think that's the way to go. And I only use the Oligoscan at this point, just because one is more cost effective than a lot, and you can get more information because you can see, are the metals coming out of organs, and you can see this detox cycling phenomena, and you can just see how the body is processing metals. So it's absolutely incredible. All right, one more I want to look at here. This is an individual who got tested with the Oligoscan, and you can see incredibly high levels of mercury, along with some of the other metals, but mercury was off the charts here. And she was working with a practitioner who specialized in muscle testing. And she was a respected practitioner. She trained other practitioners in muscle testing, so she wasn't an amateur. But at the same time as she got this test, she went and got this muscle test done, and the muscle test was showing no mercury. And I'm not saying muscle testing doesn't work, but the point is that it's not going to show up. Mercury is not going to show up in a muscle test if your body's not actively processing it. So this also wouldn't have shown up on urine, on hair, or on any other metal test because her body was keeping it tucked away in fat and it wasn't actively processing it. And that's probably because, as you can see, the vitamin D is not even showing up. That's a problem. The minerals are an absolute disaster. So a lot of health issues going on here, and her body just appeared not to feel comfortable releasing mercury because it was going to be too stressful of an experience. Now, this lady continued on the protocol from her practitioner for about a year. She came back and retested, and here we have the results. This is 11 and a half months later. So basically a year after she said she was taking about 40 different supplements, a lot of detox and a lot of herbals and nutritionals, etc. And you can see that she was detoxing things, right? Metals are on the move. She has a lot of metals, but they are moving, which means her body is pushing them out, which is great. But the mercury has not moved at all. And this is a year later, 262, zero movement in mercury. One, it just shows you once again that Oligoscan is incredibly reproducible, very sensitive test. But concerning that, the mercury didn't move. Now, mercury does tend to be the most difficult to remove because it's generally the most toxic, and the body's more resistant to let it go. So it's the most likely to be a false negative on any test because a lot of times the body's just not letting it go. So people get high levels of, cadmium or lead or something else, and they assume that's their primary metal problem. But a lot of times it's mercury and it's just not showing up. So that's something to consider. So after she got this done, she went back to the practitioner and got muscle tested and continued to have zero mercury showing up on the muscle testing. And it kind of lines up with this because if the metal's not moving at all and it's stuck in tissue, that means the body's not processing it. It's just in storage. So it's not going to show up on any sort of bioenergetic test like an electrodermal screening or muscle testing, because those are measuring the body's response to specific things. So very interesting. Now, what we didn't know was maybe this cycled back and forth and she actually was detoxing mercury. So I said, come back in a month, let's retest. So she came back in a month. The other metals are still moving. Mercury's not moving at all. So her body just was not willing. And her metals, you can see, her minerals are still all messed up. Still a lot of issues. So her body just didn't seem to be in a position to be able to safely remove the mercury. And the body just wasn't going to let go. So very interesting. So that's kind of the comparison of the test. You just have to understand what is being measured, right? Urine is what's coming out of your urine, right? What's being excreted. You're going to get false negatives if your body's not excreting properly. Blood is going to measure the transport system, right? If you were just exposed, it's probably going to be in the blood. Otherwise, the body takes the metals from the blood and it puts it into tissue. It's no longer going to show up in the blood. The hair is measuring excretion as well. It's more of a 3-month average of what you've been excreting over a 3-month period. You've got the bioenergetic testing like the electrodermal screening, the muscle testing, and other forms. Those are going to be measuring the body's response to how metals are potentially affecting the body. So, and then you've got the Oligoscan, which is measuring the actual tissue level. So it's the least likely to give you a false negative because you're measuring tissue. So everyone's going to have some level of metals in their tissue. And then if the levels rise, it indicates that the metals are coming out of organs. And if the metals lower, it indicates that the metals are leaving the body. And that's when they would show up in the other tests. So I'm a huge advocate for the Oligoscan. I'm not affiliated with the company, but I use it personally. I used it for our case studies program at Zeolite Labs to get some incredible results. And we've seen that ZeoCharge, our signature Zeolite product, is incredible at detoxing, all levels of detox, but pretty cool stuff. But anyway, I love the Oligoscan. You can look it up, see if there's a practitioner near you offering it. You can check out their website, theoligoscan.com. But that's my go-to. But regardless of what testing method you use and you're utilizing, just understand what it is you're looking at. And I'm an advocate for regular testing because you want to identify trends and see how the body is processing the metals, because it's less about looking at, where you are at point A and then trying to get to zero in 6 months. You want to see what is happening. The data is in the journey. So you want to see how the body's processing things to see if you're actually detoxing. Well, thanks for watching, everyone. That's what I've got. That's what I've got for you. That's basically my 2 cents worth. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. You can check out my website, zeolitelabs.com. You can email me, jeff@zeolitelabs.com. Happy to answer any questions you might have. But thanks for watching, and happy detoxing, everyone.